Hello and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social and governance. I'm your host for today, Andie Wood. Today we're talking about the final recommendations from the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or more usually called TNFD, which were published last month. There has been significant demand across the board for standards to help guide companies with disclosures related to natural capital. But with that demand, why now? And why specifically nature now? So let's start with a bit of background on how we got to where we are. There is growing recognition that nature-related risks can affect long-term enterprise value, the global economy, and society. About $44 trillion of global economic value generation is moderately or highly dependent on natural assets and their ecosystems, and that's according to the World Economic Forum. And we also see this translate, unsurprisingly, into attention at the policy level. Last December, nearly 200 governments agreed and signed the Global Biodiversity Framework at COP15 in Montreal. Now, while both of these are pretty compelling reasons to start, they still leave me asking why. What is it about nature and nature-related risks that has the topic at the head of those agendas? Well, let's have a think really about what we mean by natural capital, and therefore what are nature-related risks. And I'm going to warn in advance, I'm afraid this is a bit of a long one, but bear with me. Natural capital is a term that was coined to describe how nature and business interact in a way that helps build nature into the functioning of a corporation, much as we look to do with other ESG topics, for example, human capital. Natural capital most famously at the moment, I think, includes biodiversity, more on that in a bit, but broadly encompasses all natural resources that we depend upon: water, soil, wood, air, light, and I am going to include in this coal and oil as well. I can keep listing. We eat, we drink, we build our houses of natural resources, we create medicines from plants, we warm ourselves with natural fuels. We are very, very dependent, and there's that word again, on the natural environment around us. Now that brings me very neatly to another why. Is there a relationship between carbon and nature? It seems to make sense that there should be, and indeed there is. Carbon is really a part of nature. As an element, it performs vital functions in most living organisms, and of course, it is present in our atmosphere. And that is where our focus on carbon via the so-called greenhouse gases comes from. It's why we talk about carbon accounting. It's why when we're talking about how to mitigate and understand climate risks, climate opportunities, and transition, we talk a lot about carbon. But carbon is also present as part of a naturally occurring cycle in nature. It is used by plants and animals to build sugars, cells, leaves, tree trunks. And it's also released back into the atmosphere as we breathe and as we decompose. The longer an organism lives, the more carbon it is built from, and the more that remains out of the atmosphere. And if that tree, say, since that is one of the classic examples of a long-lived carbon-locking organism, doesn't decompose, it falls into a peat bog, or it's compressed under layers of soil and rock, then we get oil and coal and gas and peat, and that carbon is not released for millions of years, or until we burn it. Now, life locks up carbon, and plant life in particular is very good at locking up carbon. And that life depends on all of those other natural resources that I listed earlier in the same way that we do. In particular, obviously, water, soil. The natural environment is a very interconnected system. That's one of the reasons we get this term ecosystem. So many of our best options for mitigating climate risk and for transitioning are natural and living. So that link between natural capital and the natural world and how we address and we work with climate change is very, very tight. And of course, another thing I did say I'd bring back biodiversity is life is better off if it is diverse. And that's why there is such a strong focus there. Diversity might seem a little bit like an arbitrary goal to focus on. Why, for example, do we not just pick up and take care of what might be considered key species? Species that we depend heavily on, like bananas, wheat, certain types of tree. So to summarize what is actually potentially quite a complex topic, the diversity of life is what gives it its resilience. Much as, for example, a company might decide that in order to have a longer term resilience plan in case of, say, a disruption of a supply chain, it has diverse supply chains. It might produce diverse ranges of products or solutions. That diversity in life has the same function. It allows it to adapt to diseases, to new predators, and to some extent, to changes in the environment caused by outside forces. Diverse life also gives us ways to help adapt our dependencies on life, such as our agriculture and what we eat, so that it can do the same. And we can adapt the crops that we grow so that they are a little more resilient over time. We can only do that if that natural diversity is available for us to base that resilience on. And it's where we also find new medicines, and diverse species also make up the ecosystems. So those are the systems, the environments, the networks within forests or plains or peat bogs that our key species that I mentioned earlier depend heavily on for their own existence. So that, in a nutshell, is why there is such a demand for reporting on nature. So now let's take a quick look and take us back to that reporting. What actually is TNFD? So as I said earlier, that name TNFD might sound a bit familiar to you because it is very, very similar in nature to a previous line of work, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. Now that was, of course, all about carbon and greenhouse gases, a topic I have just been talking about as well. And the same kind of framework structure has been used to address nature-related disclosures. So you might remember, we talk about TCFD a lot, and it forms the underlying framework basis for a number of different standards that have come forth since. It has been instrumental in that positioning of greenhouse gas emissions on corporate state and government stakeholder agendas. It's been particularly key because it allows those issues to be something that can be methodically reported upon and understood. And it's really given everybody a very solid framework for understanding what it is they need to think about when they're thinking about climate-related issues and what it is that they need to disclose on climate-related issues. It's also, of course, as a project and as an ongoing system, been handed over to be managed by the International Sustainability Standards Board as part of that big push for global consolidation. So TNFD, as can be seen from the initials, is similar. It's an international market-led initiative. It's funded across the board by nonprofits, the UN, by governments, and it addresses the need for that same kind of clear market-driven framework to understand our dependencies on natural capital and nature. And it does bring in that new term. So the TNFD does borrow a lot from TCFD in order to keep what was very successful about that model and to keep something that corporations already have a certain familiarity with. It's modeled around those pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. But it also, as well as thinking about risks and opportunities, it does bring in that term and that need to understand our dependencies on the natural world and our natural resources. Where is it that we have risks and opportunities because we are dependent on the water and the fresh water? Where is it we have risks and opportunities because we are wholly dependent on the soil that we grow our crops in? I think the other thing that's very important to note about what the TNFD has done is that obviously it has arisen over the last few years as a new initiative in an environment of consolidation and interoperability. And as such, it's done a lot of work to draw from the work that the International Sustainability Standards Board has been doing. They're moving on to nature-related reporting as one of their next topics, but they have been collaborating and keeping an eye on what's been going on with TNFD. The GRI standards, of course, have also already done work in nature-related areas. And the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, they also have natural capital topics that they ask companies to resource on, including a dedicated biodiversity standard. So the TNFD has done its own part in this effort to not just come out as another new framework, but to be another framework in an interoperable world. So what does this actually mean for companies and institutions who want to pick this up and take a look at it? So one of the things that the TNFD has done to follow in those good footsteps from the TCFD is that they've been through an iterative development process that has brought in companies, financial institutions, and other stakeholders to build up the TNFD framework over time, but also to go through not just an iterative development process, but an iterative collaborative testing process. So for example, if you report to CDP, there's been a lot going on in there in the TNFD process as well, but the TNFD framework itself is more comprehensive. And that means that in everything that already exists in TNFD has been tested to some extent by real companies trying to perform real reporting exercises. They are continuing to work on additional standards for specific sectors. As you can imagine, just thinking about the list of topics earlier, certain sectors probably have some very specific needs when it comes to understanding their impact on the natural world. Agriculture being an immediately obvious sector, any sector that uses heavy amounts of water within its process. So that includes things like growing cotton for clothing, and it includes processes that use a lot of water in industrial manufacturing. And we also, of course, have specific sectoral requirements for the financial services because they always have that one step removed look down their value chains at how they're actually impacting the world. But it's still working on some of those sectoral standards, but the core set of disclosures is there, and then some additional metrics on top of that. Those have also been published for use. And many companies sort of outside that initial testing group are starting to sign up and say, hey, we want to pick this up. And in this very similar way to we saw with TCFD, where individual organizations and companies picked it up to say, this is going to help us put out a good, solid sustainability report. So we want to pick this up voluntarily. The TNFD itself is not picked up as a mandatory framework yet. However, I already mentioned the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Those, of course, are under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So there are a large number of companies who are going to need to be looking at this general topic area very soon. And one of the reasons that I think we see a little bit of tension in this area is, if you think back a while ago to when companies were first starting to have to report on things like carbon and greenhouse gases, and they're having to understand things like GHG and scope 1, 2, and 3. There's a lot of jargon there, and there's a lot of technical complexity in science. And it was not a familiar topic for many organizations. And we do see, I think, unsurprisingly, some of the same concerns and worries about nature reporting and biodiversity. Biodiversity is a very scientific topic. It has a lot of technical terms surrounded with it. And when we think of amazing natural ecosystems, we're often thinking about how amazing they are because of their complexity, because of their interconnectedness, because we can't necessarily separate out the impact of key species from other species. But I think one of the things that the TNFD manages to do is it is taking these things back to a sensible framework that allows companies to think in familiar terms about risks and opportunities and impacts and dependencies. And the other thing that it is doing is giving companies a process to work through that allows them to build up to a level where they can feel more confident in having expertise and understanding what it is that needs measured, and having a coherent group of metrics to aim towards. And even I think with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, there is now that bit of extra time with phased in standards for these slightly more technical topics that companies are not yet as familiar with when it comes to reporting. So I think advocates for TNFD are really hoping that it can emulate that success of TCFD by bringing that accessible market approach to a topic that many see as very complex. So assuming that you are one of those organizations that both has an understanding that it might well be impacted or have dependencies on natural resources, and is really wanting to help address the stakeholder demand for more information in that area, what can you do to start to get your head around this? Well, firstly, I think an important thing to remember is that connection I already discussed between climate and nature. One of the reasons this is in such demand is that there is a very, very comprehensive link between these two topics. You may hear the term nature positive transition used with relation to things like climate transition and net zero goals. The idea that achieving a climate transition where a company is reducing the amount of carbon that it is putting into the environment is something that should be done in a way that also has a nature positive impact. And by that, we mean, obviously, it does not destroy natural environments, it boosts them, it makes use of that carbon locking power of nature and takes into account that, say, a forest planted for offsetting that consists of one species is not necessarily the ideal biodiverse forest that would provide a boost to natural biodiversity and potentially lock up more carbon with its diversity of species. In order to sort of get started, obviously, the traditional, I think, advice applies. Start with thinking about priority areas that are most likely to be material to an organization. If water is the obvious topic to start with, maybe start with water. If biodiversity has been a hot topic in your industry for a while, then maybe starting with specific areas of biodiversity, say areas around company sites, for example, and focus on areas that are most material and areas that are specific and achievable, and start with that limited scope. I think as with many projects, this is something where an iterative approach and building up over time will be very helpful, and it allows companies to learn from what they're doing and the practices they're putting into place on the ground. It allows time for resources and competencies to build, to start to get, the knowledge of biological factors and species into the company, to look around the company to find the people who are already really familiar with that area, maybe bring them into the activity. And it also allows investors and others time to start to understand the metrics and the consistent metrics that the TNFD is providing, work out where that materiality is most important, what they most need to use, and start to give their feedback and evolve the standards. So I personally find that the TNFD development process has been incredibly open and collaborative and very clear, and they are producing some excellent documentation. So I really do hope that, along with many of those stakeholders, that we see this going very much the way of TCFD, but in a more interoperable world. So I hope you've enjoyed me talking a little bit there about nature and biodiversity. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk. It's brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. And we will talk again soon.